They said that when Caligula became emperor, Rome held its breath, not out of hope, not out of pride, but out of a quiet, trembling dread that whispered across marble corridors and among the shadows of the Palatine. Because even before he wore the crown, Rome had already sensed something wrong buried inside him. Not madness exactly, but something sharper, something colder, something shaped like cruelty wearing the mask of a child who had once survived too much. He was the son of Germanicus, the golden general adored by every soldier in the empire. As a boy, Caligula walked through camps where soldiers cheered him and gave him a tiny uniform, calling him Little Boots. But behind those cheers was blood, poison, rumors, betrayals, whispers that his father had been murdered by the Emperor Tiberius. Then came the exile and execution of Caligula's mother, then his brothers. Caligula learned early that Rome was a beast that ate its own children. And when Tiberius eventually called him to Capri, no one knew whether he was summoning a grandson or forging a weapon. Capri was a palace of fear. Every servant trembled, every cup could hold poison, every night someone vanished. Caligula watched, he listened, he learned. By the time he left that island, whatever innocence he had arrived with had long been crushed beneath sandals by those who viewed him as a pawn. And when Tiberius died, Rome thought it finally had a savior. Caligula was young, handsome, charming. The Senate praised him, the people worshipped him, but those closest to him saw the cracks first. A smile held too long, a stare that did not blink. A voice that softened only when he was imagining something terrible, and then disaster struck. A mysterious illness nearly killed him. Some said epilepsy, some said poison, some said possession. Whatever it was, when Caligula rose from his bed, he was not the same man. The light in his eyes had dimmed, the cruelty inside him had sharpened. Rome began to witness horrors it could not explain. His rage became unpredictable, his punishments became performances. The imperial palace transformed into a theater of fear. Caligula began summoning senators to his chambers and making them stand for hours, speaking no words, watching them shake, enjoying how terror hollowed their faces. He ordered tortures not in secret dungeons, but in open courtyards so he could walk through the screams like they were music. He believed pain revealed truth, that suffering stripped away masks, that only in fear could he see a man's true soul. Those who disappointed him faced punishments Rome had not seen since the days of tyrants long buried. Once he ordered a man thrown into the arena with beasts because the man had fallen asleep during a speech. Another time he had prisoners dragged through the streets and executed at random simply to prove that the empire and the lives inside it belonged to him alone. He delighted in humiliation, not simply killing but breaking, not simply punishment but spectacle. He replaced gladiator games with grotesque contests. Instead of skilled fighters, he filled the arena with elderly men, slaves, even senators, forced to fight animals with no armor. The crowds did not cheer, they cried. But Caligula only laughed, claiming that if Rome wished entertainment, it must learn to embrace truth. The truth, he said, was that power lived not in justice but in fear. His paranoia deepened. He believed conspiracies lurked behind every curtain. Every whisper was treason. Every silence was rebellion. He began interrogating nobles himself, pacing around them as if smelling for guilt. And when he sensed lies, the punishment was swift. Not execution, something worse. He took pleasure in designing ways to strip a person of identity, dignity, humanity. Some were forced to crawl like animals for days. Some were bound and displayed in the forum as living warnings. Some simply vanished, their names erased from records so thoroughly that even their families could not mourn them. But the darkest change was the way Caligula began to view himself. He declared that gods were not born but revealed, and that suffering was the furnace that revealed divinity. After surviving illness and betrayal and witnessing a lifetime of cruelty, he believed he had transcended humanity. He walked through the palace barefoot, saying the earth should tremble beneath his steps. He ordered temples built not to Jupiter but to himself. He placed his statues in sacred shrines and commanded priests to offer sacrifices in his honor. Some said he had lost his mind, others said he had finally embraced it. Yet the most terrifying part was not his claims of divinity but the punishments he created to enforce it. Anyone who refused to bow was beaten publicly. Anyone who hesitated to praise him was dragged by soldiers across stone floors until their knees shattered. Anyone who dared question him was thrown into chambers where the imperial torturers waited with devices designed not to kill but to break spirits. Rome had seen cruelty before. Emperors had executed enemies. Tyrants had ordered assassinations. But Caligula invented a new type of horror. Punishments not meant to enforce law but to satisfy his imagination. Once he gathered hundreds of prisoners on a cliff and ordered them pushed off because he was bored and wanted to see how far human bodies would scatter on the rocks. Once he replaced a section of arena sand with sharpened seashells so that anyone who fell would be torn open before the animals ever reached them. And once he ordered bridges built in the sea, not for transportation but for spectacle, so he could ride across them dressed as mythical kings. But the darkest part of his rule came when he realized fear alone did not satisfy him. He began creating rituals, ceremonies twisted from old Roman customs but sharpened into instruments of dread. Victims were forced to kneel before him while he pronounced judgment in a calm voice, almost gentle, before revealing punishments so imaginative that even seasoned executioners hesitated. He understood that terror paralyzed, that when people are frightened enough, even the unthinkable becomes acceptable. That was the horror's legacy, not the violence, not the torments, but the silence of a city too afraid to resist. And so as Caligula stood upon the marble steps of his palace, looking down upon senators with eyes drained of all mercy, Rome finally understood what it had created, a ruler shaped not by destiny but by wounds, not by glory but by a world that had taught him cruelty was the only path to power. And Caligula embraced that lesson with devotion because he believed fear was the purest language an emperor could speak, and Rome, bleeding beneath him, was forced to listen. They said the deeper Caligula fell into his own darkness, the more Rome began to feel as if the sun itself had dimmed. Not suddenly, but slowly, like a candle melting under an invisible hand. Senators walked with their eyes fixed to the ground. Soldiers avoided the palace corridors after dusk. Servants whispered that even the marble statues trembled when the emperor passed. But fear was only the beginning. Caligula wanted something more. He wanted Rome to understand that he alone was the architect of life and death, the master of every breath drawn within the empire. And so his punishments grew stranger, shaped not by the law but by the shifting shadows of his imagination. He began creating trials where there were no accusations, crimes where there were no victims, and verdicts before a word was spoken. Men were called before him without warning, their hands shaking, their voices cracking, because they knew that even innocence could not protect them. Caligula enjoyed watching them crumble. He enjoyed the moment where hope slipped from their eyes like water through open fingers. It was in these moments that he believed he saw the truth of humanity, a truth not of honor or virtue, but of terror. And once he tasted that truth, he hungered for more. Rome became a stage upon which he crafted nightmares. He took old Roman rituals and twisted them into spectacles that made even seasoned soldiers avert their gaze. He revived forgotten punishments from ancient tribes, reshaping them into displays meant to remind every citizen that the emperor knew no limits. There were nights when torches flickered along the banks of the Tiber while prisoners were marched to the water, their bodies trembling as Caligula watched from a balcony above, his face calm as he murmured to himself about the fragility of mortal flesh. There were days when he ordered entire families brought before him, forcing them to witness the suffering of one another so that sorrow itself became a tool of punishment. He believed this taught Rome a valuable lesson, that loyalty was worthless if it existed only in comfort, that obedience meant nothing unless it was tested by agony. The more Rome broke beneath him, the more convinced he became that he was shaping a stronger empire. But the truth was simpler. Caligula was no longer ruling Rome, he was unraveling it. Yet even as the city whispered about omens and curses, he remained untouched by threat. Those who dared imagine rebellion found themselves awake at night with a sense that unseen eyes were watching, not spies, not soldiers, the emperor himself. It was said that Caligula wandered the palace long after midnight, walking barefoot through the halls like a restless phantom. He drifted between rooms, speaking softly to shadows, asking questions no one could understand. Some believed he spoke to the spirits of his murdered family. Others believed he spoke to the gods he claimed to have surpassed. Whatever the truth, he carried those midnight conversations into his daylight judgments. His violence became more precise, more deliberate, as though guided by something beyond reason. But the darkest transformation came when Caligula decided that fear alone was not enough. He believed terror should be a philosophy, a doctrine, a faith, and he intended to become its high priest. He began to demand sacrifices not to the gods but to his own image. Statues of him appeared in temples where only the divine had ever stood. Priests were forced to rewrite prayers to include his name. Some refused, quietly at first, quietly enough to pretend it was not rebellion. But Caligula saw everything. The first priest who hesitated was dragged into the forum at dawn, his robes torn from his body as the emperor stood above him on the temple steps. Caligula declared that gods did not ask for devotion, they commanded it. Then he gave the signal. The crowd watched in silence. By evening, no priest questioned him again. Rome understood then that Caligula was not acting like a god because he believed he was one. He was acting like a god because he believed there was no one left to challenge him. His punishments grew even more theatrical. Prisoners were dressed in costumes from myths and forced to reenact tragedies, while armed guards ensured the story ended in real blood. Others were chained in public squares, so their suffering became a lesson to anyone who dared imagine defiance. But Caligula saved his most chilling cruelty for those he believed betrayed him in thought alone. He would stand behind them silently as they worked, placing a hand on their shoulder, leaning close enough for them to feel his breath, and whisper a question so calm it froze their veins. "Do you fear me?" They knew the truth did not matter. Every answer led to judgment. Every moment near him was a tightrope stretched above an abyss, and yet, despite the terror he inflicted, Caligula believed he was creating order. He believed suffering purified Rome, that cruelty revealed purity, that pain stripped away lies. In his mind, Rome had become soft under emperors who coddled it with peace. He saw himself as the fire that would forge a new empire, one where weakness burned away and only the strongest remained. But beneath that conviction lay something far more fragile. Caligula was haunted. Haunted by the ghosts of his murdered family, by the betrayals that marked his childhood, by the poison of Capri where trust had been a forgotten word. He saw treason in every silence because he had once seen treason take everything from him. And so he struck first, always, even at shadows, especially at shadows. His paranoia tightened like a noose around Rome. Senators began vanishing, guards were replaced without explanation. Even his closest advisors realized that standing too near him meant risking not only their lives but their sanity. The palace grew quieter each week, until it felt less like a seat of power and more like a tomb built for the living. But Rome, outside the palace walls, began to change too. The people who had once adored him now walked with bent heads. Taverns whispered about prophecies. Mothers told their children stories of emperors who had gone mad and drowned entire cities in blood. Every corner of Rome felt the weight of Caligula's gaze, as if he watched through every torch flame and listened through every stone archway. And then came the final transformation. Caligula stopped punishing rebellion. He began punishing loyalty. Because loyalty, once shown, could be faked. Devotion could be a disguise. And he had learned long ago that those who smiled at you could be the very ones sharpening a knife behind their back. So he sculpted a new terror. A terror where no one knew what crime they would be accused of. A terror where process and reason dissolved into the whims of a man who saw himself as judge of all souls. Rome had survived tyrants. It had survived civil war. It had survived emperors drunk on blood. But it had never seen anything like Caligula. Because he did not simply want control. He wanted to hold the empire by its heart and squeeze until every beat echoed his own. When he walked the palace at night, he spoke to the shadows as if asking them how much further he could go, and the shadows never answered. Or perhaps they did. Perhaps they whispered back that power without limit does not end in rule, it ends in ruin. And Caligula, lost in the labyrinth of his own making, kept walking deeper. Rome knew then that it was only a matter of time before the emperor who had once been Little Boots would trample the empire itself beneath his heel. And no one knew who would survive when he did.